"This priest is a fraud," the little girl exclaimed during the religious ceremony in the mansion. Then she reveals his true identity, and everyone immediately bursts into tears. Comment: giving my story a rating from 0 to 10. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The solemn silence of Sunday morning in Pleasantville, New York, was shattered by a shrill scream that echoed through the open windows of the Hawthorne mansion. Cecilia Hawthorne, 52, sighed irritably as she adjusted the string of pearls in her trembling hands. The religious ceremony she had so carefully organized was being interrupted by noises from the street, and this made her particularly tense on this important day. "Father Nicholas, I apologize for the disturbance," she murmured, watching the robed man standing before the makeshift altar in the main hall of her colonial mansion. The neighborhood children can sometimes be unruly. The man, about 45 years old, with neatly trimmed graying hair and a respectable demeanor, smiled benevolently. "Don't worry, my daughter. Children are God's joy, even when they make noise." His voice was soft, cultivated, with the solemn tone that Cecilia so admired in men of the cloth. Benjamin Hawthorne, 28, remained seated in an armchair in the corner of the room, his opaque eyes fixed on the dark hardwood floor. His hunched shoulders and vacant expression revealed the weight of the depression that had consumed him for months since he had lost the family business at the gambling tables of underground casinos in Atlantic City. His mother had insisted that the priest's blessing would help him find his way back to the light, but Benjamin doubted that any ritual could cure the darkness that dwelled in his soul. "My son greatly needs this blessing," Cecilia said, addressing the priest with teary eyes. "He has been going through difficult times, Father. He has lost his way, gotten involved with the wrong people. I believe that only divine grace can save him now." Dolores Hawthorne, 48, Cecilia's younger sister, nodded vigorously. Her dark hair was styled impeccably, and she wore her best navy blue dress for the occasion. "Father Nicholas has brought us so much hope," she said, lightly touching Cecilia's arm. "When he told us about his work with underprivileged children, I knew immediately that God had sent him to us." Father Nicholas inclined his head with humility. "I am only an instrument of divine will, Mrs. Hawthorne. The shelter we are building in upstate New York will house so many needy souls. Your generosity has made this possible." Outside the mansion, on the dirt roads that snaked through the poorer area of Pleasantville, a girl with messy blonde hair ran barefoot between the simple houses. Zelda was only 4 years old, but her eyes carried an iron determination that contrasted with her fragile appearance. In her small hands, she held a yellowed photograph, torn at the edges, an image that her mother Myrtle had shown her hundreds of times. "It's him, Mommy!" Zelda shouted, stopping in front of a modest house where her mother was washing clothes in the backyard tub. Myrtle Oliveira, 26, raised her tired face, drops of water running from her hands, reddened by soap and hard work. Her brown eyes widened when she saw her daughter's agitation. "Zelda, what are you saying? What man?" "Grandpa, the grandpa who left," exclaimed the girl, pointing in the direction of the Hawthorne mansion. "He's there, dressed as a priest, but it's him. He has the same marks on his face, the same scar on his forehead." Myrtle's heart began to beat erratically. She hadn't heard from her father, Oswald Pereira, the man who had abandoned her when he discovered she was pregnant with Zelda, in years. The last news she had of him was when she learned that he had fled from Albany, leaving debts and broken promises everywhere. "Zelda, are you sure?" "Absolutely sure?" Myrtle asked, crouching down to be at her daughter's height. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the girl's small shoulders. "Yes, Mommy. He's pretending to be a priest, but he's the grandpa in the photo," Zelda insisted, her eyes shining with a mixture of anger and confusion that a 4-year-old shouldn't know. "Why did he leave? Why didn't he want to stay with us?" Back in the mansion, the ceremony continued without anyone knowing about the storm that was approaching. Father Nicholas raised his hands to begin the prayer, his voice echoing through the walls covered with religious paintings and antique furniture that spoke of the Hawthorne family's Catholic tradition. "Lord, bless this house and all who dwell in it," he began, but his voice was suddenly interrupted by a crash at the main door. All heads turned to the entrance of the room, where a small figure had burst in like a hurricane. Zelda ran to the center of the room, her bare feet leaving dirt marks on the Persian rug that Cecilia cherished so much. The girl stopped before the makeshift altar, pointed her small finger directly at the robed man, and shouted with all the strength in her lungs, "You're not a priest, you're Oswald Pereira. You're my grandpa who abandoned Mommy." The silence that followed was deafening. Cecilia rose from her chair, her face pale with shock, while Dolores brought her hand to her chest as if she had suffered a physical blow. Benjamin, for the first time in months, raised his eyes from the floor, a spark of interest shining in his dead expression. Father Nicholas, or whoever he was, remained motionless for a few seconds that seemed eternal. His hands, which moments before had been raised in blessing, began to tremble imperceptibly. His face, until then serene and kind, contorted into an expression of poorly disguised panic. "Child," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, "you must be confused. I am Father Nicholas, servant of our Lord Jesus Christ. I have never seen you before in my life." But Zelda did not back down. Instead, she took another step forward, taking the yellowed photograph from the pocket of her worn dress. "This is your picture," she shouted, holding out the image. "Mummy has kept it forever. You have the same mark here," and she pointed to a small scar on the man's forehead, "and the same sad eyes." Cecilia felt her legs give way. All her faith, all her conviction in the goodness of that holy man who had come into her life as an answer to her prayers, began to crumble like a house of cards. The child's words echoed in her mind, mixing with a terrible suspicion that was beginning to germinate in her heart. "Dolores," she whispered, turning to her sister, Do you remember me mentioning that I felt something familiar about him, as if I knew him from somewhere?" Dolores was pale as chalk, her lips trembling as she stared at the man they knew as Father Nicholas. "Cecilia, the shelter, all the money I invested, if he isn't really a priest." The weight of this possibility fell on the two sisters like an avalanche. In the last 3 months, since Father Nicholas had arrived in town, carrying only an old suitcase and moving stories about his mission to help those in need, they had opened not only their homes, but also their hearts and their wallets to him. Benjamin rose slowly, his eyes now completely focused on the scene unfolding before him. For the first time in months, he felt something beyond emptiness. He felt anger, a growing, purifying anger that made him clench his fists. "Explain yourself," he said, his voice low, but charged with an authority he hadn't shown in a long time. "Explain yourself right now, or I'll find out who you really are myself." The robed man looked around the room, seeing the faces that had previously looked at him with adoration, now turning into masks of suspicion and growing anger. Little Zelda remained in the center of the room, like a 4-year-old avenging angel, holding the photograph that threatened to destroy 3 months of carefully constructed lies. And as the silence stretched, heavy as molten lead, everyone in the room realized that this Sunday morning, which should have been one of peace and blessing, had turned into the beginning of something that would change their lives forever. The echo of Zelda's words still reverberated through the walls of the mansion when Oswald Pereira finally allowed the mask of serenity to fall from his face. His eyes, which had previously radiated pastoral kindness, now shone with the desperation of a cornered animal. The robe he wore with such pride now felt as heavy as lead on his hunched shoulders. I can explain," he stammered, recoiling instinctively toward the wall where he had positioned the wooden crucifix. This child is confused, traumatized perhaps. You know how street kids are, always making up stories to get attention. Cecilia felt as if the floor were opening under her feet. Every word that came out of the mouth of the man she had venerated for 3 months now sounded like daggers in her devout soul. "No," she whispered, squeezing the rosary so hard that the beads began to leave red marks on her palms. "No, this can't be happening." Benjamin took a step forward, and for the first time in months, Cecilia saw something beyond apathy in her son's eyes. It was pure fury, an anger that seemed to burn away the depression that consumed him. "You lied to my mother," he said, his voice growing in intensity. "You took advantage of her faith, of her pain at seeing me destroyed." What kind of person does that? Dolores remained paralyzed, her hands trembling violently as the reality of the last few weeks rearranged itself in her mind like pieces of a macabre puzzle. The shelter in upstate New York, the donation she had made, the promise of title to her country house. It had all been an elaborate lie. "The money," she murmured, her voice coming out as a choked groan. "All the money I invested. Oswald, where's the money?" Upon hearing his real name being pronounced, Oswald shrank even further. Little Zelda remained planted in the center of the room, her big eyes fixed on the grandfather she had never met, but whom her mother had taught her to recognize through that faded photograph. "Why did you abandon Mommy?" she asked, her childish voice loaded with a pain that made the hearts of everyone present ache. "Why did you leave when she was little just like me?" At that moment, Myrtle appeared in the doorway of the mansion, breathless from running after her daughter. Her eyes scanned the scene, Zelda in the center of the room, the 2 elegant ladies looking in horror at the robed man, and him, her father, Oswald Pereira, after a decade of absence and silence. "Dad," she said, and the word came out like an accusation. "So it's true. You're here in Pleasantville, pretending to be a priest." Oswald looked at the daughter he had abandoned, pregnant and alone, and for a moment his expression softened. "Myrtle, you've grown so much, and this is—" His eyes turned to Zelda. "This is my granddaughter?" "Don't you dare call her that," Myrtle replied, rushing to take Zelda in her arms. "You lost that right 10 years ago when you disappeared without a word of explanation." Cecilia watched the family interaction with growing horror. Not only had she been deceived by an impostor, but she had opened her house, her life, and her resources to a man who was capable of abandoning his own pregnant daughter. All her faith in spiritual discernment was being shattered before her eyes. "How much?" Benjamin asked, his voice cutting like glass. "How much money did you steal from the families in this town?" Oswald hesitated, his eyes scanning the hostile faces that surrounded him. "I didn't steal anything. The donations were given voluntarily for a noble cause." "What cause?" Dolores exploded, finally finding her voice. "What shelter? I went to upstate New York last week, Oswald. There's no shelter there. The address you gave me is an empty lot." The silence that followed was charged with an almost palpable tension. Zelda began to cry softly, confused by all the anger and pain that permeated the environment. Myrtle held her tight, whispering words of comfort in the girl's ear. Cecilia slowly approached Oswald, her footsteps echoing in the silence of the room. When she stopped before him, her eyes were filled with tears, but also with an iron determination. "You know what hurts the most?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It's not the money. It's knowing that I brought into my house, close to my sick son, into the sanctuary of my faith, a man capable of abandoning an innocent child." Oswald lowered his eyes, unable to sustain Cecilia's accusatory gaze. "You don't understand," he murmured. "I needed the money. I had debts, commitments. It was never my intention to hurt anyone." "Never your intention?" Benjamin repeated, taking another step forward. "You dressed as a priest, profaned sacred symbols, lied about charitable works, and you say it was never your intention to hurt anyone." Dolores approached the group, her eyes shining with tears of fury and disappointment. "The deed to my country house," she said, her voice breaking. "You said you needed it as collateral for the bank loan. Where's the document?" Oswald recoiled even further until his back touched the wall. "Dolores, I can explain. The bank demanded additional guarantees, but the money will be returned as soon as—" "Where's the deed?" Dolores repeated louder this time. It's safe, in a trusted financial institution." Benjamin laughed, but it was a bitter sound, without any trace of humor. "In a trusted financial institution," he repeated. "You mean you sold my aunt's property to fund your scams?" Myrtle, who had remained silent hugging Zelda, finally spoke again. "How many families, Dad? How many families did you deceive with this priest charade?" Oswald looked at his daughter, and for a moment something that might have been remorse flickered in his eyes. "Myrtle, when you were little, I tried to be a good father. But the debts, the problems, I couldn't support you two anymore. So you simply disappeared," Myrtle said, her voice laden with 10 years of pain. "Without a word, without an explanation. You left me 4 months pregnant, working as a cleaner to be able to pay the renting a room in a boarding house." Zelda stirred in her mother's arms, her big eyes still fixed on Oswald. "Grandpa," she said, her voice small and confused, "why are you mean?" The child's innocent question hit Oswald like a punch to the gut. He crouched down, trying to get to his granddaughter's height, but Myrtle immediately recoiled, protecting Zelda. "I'm not mean, sweetie," he said, his voice breaking. I just made a lot of mistakes." Cecilia watched the whole scene with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. Her mind was still struggling to process the magnitude of the betrayal. 3 months of joint prayers, of conversations about faith and redemption, of renewed hope for Benjamin's future. It had all been built on lies. "Are there other towns?" she asked suddenly. "Other families that you've conned in the same way?" Oswald hesitated too long before answering, and that hesitation was answer enough. Benjamin clenched his fists, his fury growing with each second. "How many?" Benjamin insisted. "How many families have you destroyed with your lies?" "I never destroyed anyone," Oswald protested. "People gave the money voluntarily, believing in a just cause." "A cause that didn't exist," Dolores shouted. "You invented underprivileged children, non-existent shelters, false needs to steal money from good-hearted people." Dolores' scream echoed through the mansion, and at that moment, something within Cecilia broke definitively. She, who had always been the rock of the family, the source of strength and faith for everyone around her, felt her legs give way. Benjamin noticed immediately and rushed to support his mother. "Mom, sit down," he said, helping her to an armchair. "Take a deep breath." For the first time in months, Cecilia saw genuine concern in her son's eyes, and that made her cry even more. Even in the midst of chaos and betrayal, Benjamin was there, taking care of her, showing signs of the person she knew he could still be. Myrtle watched the family in crisis and felt a pang of something she didn't expect. Compassion. These people had been victims of her father just as much as she had been years ago. "Mrs. Hawthorne," she said softly, "I'm so sorry for what my father did to you." Cecilia raised her teary eyes to Myrtle. "You're not to blame, dear. The blame is mine for having been so blind, so naive." "It's not your fault," Benjamin said, his voice laden with a growing conviction. "It's his fault." He turned to Oswald, his eyes shining with determination. "And he's going to pay for it. He's going to return every penny he stole, undo every lie he told." Oswald looked at the young man, who spoke with such authority, and felt a chill. There was something in Benjamin's posture that suggested he wasn't just making empty threats. He was a man who had lost everything, and therefore had nothing left to lose. "And if I can't return everything?" Oswald asked, his voice almost a whisper. Benjamin smiled, but it was a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Then you'll find out that there are consequences for taking advantage of people's good faith. And those consequences will be much more painful than any debt you've ever had. The air in the room was thick with tension when Zelda suddenly stirred in Myrtle's arms, pointing to a leather briefcase that was on a side table. "Mommy," she said, "Grandpa hid papers there. I saw him messing with them when I thought no one was looking." All eyes turned to the briefcase, and Oswald paled visibly. Benjamin moved toward the table with determined steps, and when Oswald tried to intercept him, the young man pushed him away with a force that surprised everyone. "Don't you dare touch me," Benjamin said, opening the briefcase. What he found inside would turn the Sunday afternoon into an even more shocking revelation than any of them could have imagined. Benjamin opened the leather briefcase with trembling hands, and what he found made his blood run cold. They weren't just random documents, but a true, organized archive of Oswald's lies. There were handwritten lists with names of families, amounts donated, addresses from different towns in New York State, and even a notebook where he wrote down personal details about each victim, their weaknesses, their fears, their hopes. "My God," Benjamin murmured, flipping through the pages with growing horror. "You documented everything, every lie, every family you conned. This is a manual on how to destroy people." Cecilia rose from the armchair, still unsteady, but driven by an urgent need to see with her own eyes the extent of the betrayal. "Show me," she said, extending her trembling hand. Benjamin hesitated for a moment, fearing that the contents of the briefcase could be too devastating for his mother, but she insisted with a determined look. When Cecilia saw her own name at the top of a page, along with detailed notes about her extreme religiosity and vulnerability after problems with her son, she felt as if she had been slapped in the face. "He studied me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Like a predator studies its prey." Dolores approached and read over her sister's shoulder. Her own name was a few pages ahead, with observations about her trusting nature and willingness to invest in lost causes. Next to it, there were numbers, specific amounts she had donated over the months, including the promise of the deed to the country house. $53,000, Dolores read aloud, her voice rising an octave. "You wrote down exactly how much you managed to get out of me, as if it were a business." Oswald recoiled even further against the wall, his desperate eyes jumping from one furious face to another. "You don't understand the pressure I was facing," he said, his voice sounding weaker and weaker. "The people I owe money to aren't the type to accept excuses." Myrtle shook her head, still holding Zelda firmly. "It's always been like this with you, Dad. Always had an excuse to justify your mistakes, a reason to make others pay for your bad choices." Benjamin continued flipping through the briefcase and found something even more disturbing. Photographs. They were images of himself, taken apparently without his knowledge, showing him in different states of depression, leaving bars, walking the streets with a desolate expression, sitting alone in public squares. "You followed me," Benjamin said, his voice laden with an icy rage. "You stalked me to get information about my family. I needed to understand the family dynamic," Oswald protested. "I needed to know how to approach you in the right way." "How to manipulate us in the right way," Cecilia corrected, her faith and naivety finally giving way to a bitter understanding of reality. "You turned us into targets, studied our pain, to know exactly where to stick the knife." Zelda, who had remained quiet in Myrtle's arms, suddenly pointed to another section of the briefcase. "Mommy, there are more pictures there, of other people." Benjamin followed the little girl's finger and found an entire section dedicated to other families. There were the Bakers from White Plains, the Smiths from Scarsdale, the Millers from Rye. Each family had its own file, with photographs, detailed notes on vulnerabilities, and meticulous records of how much money had been extracted from each one. "How many families?" Dolores asked, her voice almost a whisper. "How many families have you destroyed?" Oswald remained silent, but Benjamin continued counting the files. 12, he said finally. 12 families in 6 different towns. He stopped at a specific page, and his face paled. It says here that the Baker family from White Plains lost their house. They mortgaged the property to donate to your non-existent shelter. Cecilia felt as if the world were collapsing around her. It wasn't just her family that had been victimized. Oswald had destroyed the lives of dozens of people with his elaborate lies. "And the money?" Myrtle asked, looking directly at her father. "What did you do with all that money?" Oswald hesitated, and Benjamin took advantage of the pause to continue exploring the briefcase. At the bottom, he found bank statements from multiple accounts and different branches. The numbers were staggering. More than $200,000 accumulated over 2 years of scams. $200,000, Benjamin read aloud. "You stole $200,000 from working families." "I didn't steal," Oswald insisted, but his voice had lost all conviction. "People gave the money voluntarily." "Based on lies," Dolores exploded. "You invented underprivileged children, non-existent orphanages, fabricated emergencies." At that moment, Zelda stirred in Myrtle's arms and said something that made everyone freeze. "Grandpa, do you have money stored at Aunt Rose's house?" All eyes turned to the girl, and then to Oswald, whose face had turned as white as paper. Little Zelda, with her 4-year-old innocence, had just revealed something that not even the documents in the briefcase mentioned. "What, Aunt Rose?" Myrtle asked, frowning. "Aunt Rose, who lives in the blue house near the market," Zelda replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "I saw Grandpa there the other day carrying a big suitcase. She said she was going to keep it for him." Oswald closed his eyes, as if he were feeling physical pain. Rose was his sister, the only person in the family who still maintained contact with him, and apparently the only person he trusted enough to keep the stolen money. Benjamin approached Oswald with slow and deliberate steps. "Where is this Rose's house?" I can't," Oswald stammered. "Where is the house?" Benjamin repeated, his voice low but laden with threat. Myrtle watched the growing tension in the room and made a decision. "Aunt Rose lives on Flower Street, number 47, she said. "She's my father's sister, the only one who never cut contact with him." Cecilia looked at Myrtle with gratitude and then turned to Oswald. "You're going to take us there," she said, her voice now firm and authoritative. "You're going to take us to your sister, and you're going to return every penny you stole." "And if I refuse?" Oswald asked, in a last attempt to maintain some control over the situation. Benjamin smiled, but it was a smile that had no trace of humor. "Then I'll pay a visit to the Pleasantville police station with all these documents. I'm sure they'll be very interested to learn about your work." The threat of police involvement made Oswald recoil even further. He knew he was in a hopeless situation, surrounded by all the families he had conned, and with documentary evidence of all his crimes. Dolores, who had remained relatively calm until then, suddenly exploded. "My country house?" she screamed. "Where's the deed to my country house?" Oswald mumbled something inaudible, and Dolores approached him with renewed fury. "Where's the document?" It was used as collateral in a financial operation," Oswald admitted finally. "What financial operation?" Benjamin pressed. "A loan with loan sharks in New York City," Oswald said, the words coming out as if each one caused physical pain. "I needed fast money to pay off other debts, and they demanded real guarantees." The silence that followed was deafening. Dolores felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. Her country house, the property she had inherited from her parents and that represented all her financial security, had been given to loan sharks as collateral for a loan that financed more scams. "How much?" she asked, her voice coming out as a groan. How much did you borrow using my property?" "60,000, Oswald admitted. "And how much do you owe now?" Oswald hesitated for so long that everyone understood that the answer would be worse than they imagined. "With interest, about 90,000. Dolores slumped into a chair, the weight of the realization hitting her like an avalanche. Not only had she lost all her savings, but now her property was in the hands of loan sharks, and the debt had grown beyond any possibility of repayment. Cecilia watched her sister's despair and felt an iron determination grow in her chest. Oswald had destroyed her family, abused her faith, manipulated her pain, and now she discovered that he had done the same to dozens of other people. But he made a mistake. He had documented everything meticulously. "Benjamin," she said, her voice laden with an authority he hadn't heard in years, "take those documents. We're going to Rose's house right now." "And then?" asked Myrtle, still holding Zelda. Cecilia looked at the young mother and her daughter, the two oldest and perhaps most wounded victims of Oswald's scams. "Then we're going to do something he never expected his victims to do," she said. "We're going to unite. All the families he conned, all the people he manipulated. We're going to join together and make sure he pays for every lie, for every tear, for every dream he destroyed." Oswald looked at the growing determination in the eyes of the people he had conned and realized that he had greatly underestimated the power of collective fury. What had started as a simple scam was turning into something much bigger and more dangerous. A crusade for justice led by people who had nothing left to lose. And as the sun began to set over Pleasantville, everyone in the room knew that the long journey to recover what had been stolen was just beginning. The walk to Flower Street was tense and silent. Oswald walked in front, escorted closely by Benjamin, while Cecilia, Dolores, Myrtle and Zelda walked behind, forming a determined group that caught the attention of curious neighbors. The late Sunday afternoon sun painted the simple houses of Pleasantville with golden hues, creating an ironic contrast to the gravity of the situation. Rose Pereira was a 51-year-old woman, her graying hair tied in a bun and her hands calloused from housework. When she saw her brother approaching, accompanied by a group of visibly angry people, her face contorted with worry. She knew Oswald well enough not to recognize the signs that he had gotten into serious trouble again. "Oswald," she said, opening the door of her simple but clean and organized house, "what have you done this time?" Before Oswald could answer, Cecilia stepped forward. "Mrs. Rose, your brother has conned my family and many others, posing as a priest and stealing money destined for non-existent charities. We know he brought money to your house, and we've come to get it." Rose looked at her brother with a mixture of disappointment and anger that was clearly familiar between them. "Oswald, you promised me the money was from honest work. You said you had finally found a decent job." "It is honest work," Oswald protested weakly, but even he seemed to have lost conviction in his own lies. "Lying to religious families, inventing underprivileged children, and stealing money from hard-working people is honest work," Myrtle retorted, her voice laden with the accumulated pain of years of abandonment. Rose closed her eyes for a moment, as if preparing to face a reality she had suspected for a long time. "Come in," she said finally. "Let's sort this out once and for all." The interior of Rose's house was modest but welcoming, with well-maintained antique furniture and family photographs on the walls. Zelda looked around with curiosity, and Rose noticed the girl for the first time. "Is this your granddaughter?" she asked, crouching down to be at Zelda's height. "Yes," Myrtle replied. "This is Zelda. She's the one who discovered the truth about your brother today." Rose studied the girl's face and smiled sadly. "She has his eyes when he was a child," she said, "before everything went wrong." Oswald shifted uncomfortably, but Rose ignored him and addressed the group. "The money is in my room, in a suitcase under the bed. But before you take everything, I need you to know something important about my brother." Everyone turned to her, expecting another devastating revelation. But what Rose said surprised them completely. "Oswald suffers from a mental illness," she said, the words coming out slowly, as if each one caused pain. "Compulsive hoarding disorder, combined with severe depressive episodes. He can't spend the money he collects, even when he's in need." Cecilia frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means that all the money he stole from you is intact," Rose explained. "He never spent a dime. He just hoards compulsively, as if the money were a protection against some future disaster. Benjamin looked at Oswald with a confused expression. You mean he has $200,000 saved and still continued to con families? More than that, Rose said, walking towards the bedroom. Come and see. She led them to a small room at the back of the house where there were not one, but 3 large suitcases under the bed. When Rose opened the first one, everyone fell silent. It was full of money, $50 and $100 bills, organized in meticulously arranged packets. My God, Dolores whispered. How much is here? Rose opened the other 2 suitcases, revealing even more money. $340,000, she said. He's obsessively counted it every night for the last 2 years. Myrtle looked at her father with an expression that mixed anger and something that might have been pity. You destroyed so many people's lives to accumulate money you don't even use. Oswald finally spoke, his voice almost a whisper. When our family lost everything we had, when I was a child, I promised myself I would never be in need again. But the more money I collected, the more afraid I was of losing it. And the more afraid I was, the more money I needed to collect. Cecilia watched the man who had destroyed her peace of mind and felt something unexpected, not forgiveness, but a complex understanding of the human tragedy before her. That doesn't justify what you did, she said firmly. Mental illness is no excuse for destroying innocent lives. I know, Oswald said, looking at Zelda, who was watching everything with her big, curious eyes. I know there's no excuse for what I did to you, to Myrtle, to my granddaughter. I just didn't know how to stop anymore. Rose approached the group with a determined expression. I have a proposal, she said. Oswald will return all the money to all the families he conned, every penny, and he will turn himself in to the authorities. What about Dolores's country house? Benjamin asked. I'll resolve the issue with the loan sharks, Rose said. I have some savings put aside, and with part of this money I can pay off the debt and recover the deed. Dolores looked at Rose with gratitude and disbelief. Why would you do that? You don't even know me. Because I've spent 40 years watching my brother destroy lives, including his own. It's time to fix at least some of the damage. Zelda, who had remained quiet throughout the conversation, suddenly approached Oswald. Grandpa, she said, her voice small but clear, can you come live with us now? Mommy said you left because you didn't have money, but now you have a lot of money. The girl's innocent question hit Oswald like a stab. He crouched down to be at his granddaughter's height, tears running down his face. Sweetie, I didn't leave because of money. I left because I was too cowardly to be a good father to your mother and a good grandfather to you. Myrtle watched the interaction between father and daughter, struggling against contradictory emotions. Zelda, she said softly, Grandpa needs to fix all the mistakes he's made first. That's going to take a long time. Oswald looked at his daughter with pleading eyes. Myrtle, I know I don't deserve it, but could you give me a chance to get to know my granddaughter? To be at least a small part of her life. Myrtle hesitated for a long moment. After you return all the money, after you turn yourself into the authorities, after you spend the time you have to spend paying for your mistakes. Maybe, but only if you prove you've really changed. Cecilia watched the whole scene and felt a transformation happening within herself. Her faith had been shaken, her trust destroyed, but witnessing that family trying to reconnect despite all the pain was teaching her something new about forgiveness and redemption. Benjamin, she said, turning to her son, you organized a support group for the victims. That was the first really important thing you've done in months. Benjamin looked at his mother with surprise. Mom, You found a purpose, Cecilia continued. Helping people who have suffered as we have suffered. That doesn't erase your depression overnight, but it's a start. Over the 8 months that followed, Benjamin kept his word. He organized bi-weekly meetings with all the families victimized by Oswald, helped each one recover their money, and worked tirelessly to rebuild the trust that had been broken. His depression didn't magically disappear, but having a purpose greater than his own pain gave him the strength to seek proper treatment. Dolores recovered her country house and discovered a new passion: caring for truly underprivileged children, not the imaginary ones invented by Oswald. She transformed part of her property into a real community support center, funded partially by the recovered money that she decided to reinvest in genuine causes. Cecilia found a renewed faith, more human and less rigid. Her experience with Oswald taught her that trusting people didn't mean being naive, and that forgiving didn't mean forgetting or allowing mistakes to be repeated. Myrtle and Zelda were invited by Cecilia to live temporarily in the mansion while Myrtle looked for a better job. The coexistence between the two women, who had suffered different but equally painful abandonments, blossomed into a genuine friendship based on mutual understanding. And Oswald, he kept his promise. He returned every penny to every family, turned himself in to the authorities, and confessed to all his crimes. During the 2 years he spent in a work release program performing community service, he began treatment for his mental illness and slowly learned to deal with his compulsions. When he was finally released, Oswald found Myrtle and Zelda waiting for him at the exit. It wasn't complete forgiveness, nor a fantastic new beginning, but it was a chance, an opportunity to get to know his granddaughter, to slowly build a relationship based on honesty instead of lies. The story ended not with a magical redemption, but with something more valuable: proof that even after the deepest betrayal, it is possible to rebuild lives, relationships, and hope. The community center created by Dolores became a symbol of that renewal, a place where families in genuine need found real support, built on pain, transformed into solidarity. And Zelda, who had started it all with her innocent courage to tell the truth, grew up knowing that sometimes the people we love disappoint us, but that doesn't mean we should stop believing in the possibility of change, forgiveness, and a new beginning. If you liked this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment on what you thought of my story, giving it a rating from 0 to 10. And thank you very much.